What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Real Bodybuilding Podcast. This is not a bodybuilding and bollocks. This is just a real bodybuilding podcast because I have Samuel Buckner with us, who is Samuel. Do you want to give us your full title?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a associate professor of exercise science at the University of South Florida and director of the USF Muscle Lab. So
Okay.
I run a lab that studies muscle growth and how muscles grow in response to different interventions.
Okay. So the reason we're talking is because James, I'll give you a little bit of a rundown. Um, Me and you, James, and some others on the podcast are constantly ranting about the science group of people online that kind of take that moniker and make it theirs, and they claim to be the science people. Well, Samuel reached out to me and he said a lot of the science that's out there is not actual science, but people just kind of, I don't know, what would you say, Samuel, making it up or winging it or contorting the truth?
Yeah, I wouldn't say winging it or making it up, but maybe exploiting it um, for clicks or maybe overvaluing the data or presenting the data in a way that's a lot more compelling than
Okay.
it actually is.
So I don't mind people. I'm saying I don't mind like I'm an authority. I'm not an authority. When I think of it, I don't mind people making videos and getting clicks using the science. That part doesn't bother me. When you say exploiting it, that part doesn't necessarily bother me. But when you say making it more compelling by stretching it,
Yeah.
that's the part that bothers me. Because if you're putting too much emphasis on something and discounting years of other evidence or years of what other guys have been doing, because you have this one piece of evidence that you're stretching out now, I think that's kind of the part that bothers me. Is I think people are really pointing to a lot of studies and a lot of I keep putting science in air quotes as like the rule and not just part of a tool for a more holistic approach to bodybuilding.
Yeah, I think classically, science should exist to kind of observe things and then try to put them to the test. And for example, if y'all do something in a video and you've had good experience with it, we can maybe test it and see if we can understand
Right.
why something works a little bit better. I think with social media, like becoming just more of something that people engage in, and in particular, scientists wanting to become influencers and get involved in social media, scientists take it on the other role of just kind of critiquing everything and explaining why everything is wrong.
Yes.
And if you're smart and intelligent enough, you can make a lot of people look stupid
Hmm.
with the science that you point to, um, and how you present it. And I hopefully we can provide some examples today of situations where this has been done.
Right.
But yeah, that's why I walked up to you at the expo at the Pittsburgh because I just thought it was really interesting that on y'all's channel, and I listen to the podcast pretty regularly. Y'all will be frustrated with science, right? And I'm a researcher. I'm in the science. I'm not necessarily. I don't have a huge presence on social media or anything. That's not the game that I play. But I thought it was interesting that scientists have the same frustrations,
Yes.
right? And that,
I've heard that.
I consume it, I follow all this stuff because this is my world. I'm kind of obsessed.
Yeah.
And my students will text me when there's a new science-based post, like, have you seen this? And then we'll read the paper and we'll talk about it. And just so much of it is noise. And so much of it, I think, is this appeal to authority.
Right.
They could say, okay, well, James is big and strong, but I have a PhD, and I'll tell you why everything he's doing is wrong, and you could
Can,
do it better.
can I interrupt you for a second there? Because I think
Yeah.
bodybuilders, and I'm going to be as open and honest as I can
Mhm.
be. James, you can do the same if you
For
want,
sure.
but I think bodybuilders do the same thing.
Absolutely. They mirror that.
I think bodybuilders do the same thing when it comes to making an argument from authority. Like, look how big I am. Fuck you.
Mm.
You don't know
Yeah.
anything. Look how big I am.
Yeah.
Right. So uh, I think both groups are doing it. Now, I just want to
Yeah.
clarify one thing, and I think James can agree with this. You can touch on it after, James.
Yep.
I'm not against science. I never have been
Yeah.
because one of my, of all the coaches I've had, my favorite coach, my mentor is probably John Meadows. Now, John Meadows was, I think, pretty much wrote books and was a strength conditioning coach
Mhm.
and used a lot of science in his seminars and things like that. And what he would tell me is, look, science can't explain everything we're doing. He goes, sometimes you can ask me a question and I can't point to a study as to why it works. I just know it works. So kind of from all the conversations I had with John, what I gathered was like, look, let's use science as a tool. Let's perfect what we're doing as bodybuilders and not do things that are stupid.
Mm-hmm.
But let's also not discount decades of what previous guys before us have done.
Yeah.
So I don't know, James, do you want to touch on
My only chime in on that really is that obviously the existing kind of approach to training that's been around for a long time for the majority of people, that is also science. So it's almost like trying to find new science for no reason sometimes is what bothers me. So, if something's proven to work, then why is there a need to then try to find another reason? And I get it. If something's an advancement or beneficial and helpful and takes something further, then so be it. But like you say, there's camps and there's decisions and divisions in a lot of what we see, and that's where there's the problem that occurs. But like I say, there's science behind the what you'd call the basic bodybuilding.
yeah,
It's just that we don't really delve into it because it's been around so long we don't see the fact. But if you sat down and you looked into how, the majority of people used to bodybuild, you'll be able to dig out all the science.
you know what I think the main problem is, I think what it boils down to is respect.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think everybody wants to be validated for their point of view. And I think when you have guys like me and James who've put in 20 years of lifting, we've built a certain physique, we've built a certain amount of muscle, it's hard to watch someone come along that's read a book that maybe hasn't built the same amount of muscle or hasn't had that much success or doesn't have a client base that they can point to that say, look, it worked, I can show you. It feels a little disrespectful to discount my 20 years of effort, or not even my personal, but the decades of bodybuilders that came before me.
Yeah.
When the person that's discounting it hasn't proven out their theory, they're just saying, well, we saw a study. So I think that's where, and then I'm sure the people on the other side feel the same way. They're like, well, you're disrespecting me because I'm small or smaller. But like, this is a proven fact. It's been replicated in science.
Yeah.
So I think both parties are kind of like talking past each other.
Yeah, 100%.
I definitely think that's true. And within the scientific community, it happens too. So this is like the layers of respect.
Yeah.
So in science, I've seen scientific communicators make fun of other scientists because like, well, look at these scientists. They don't even look like they lift.
Right.
And, a lot of them, I think the most brilliant person in the world as far as skeletal muscle physiology is Troy Hornberger. And it's somebody that I don't think a lot of people would know because he's not on social media. He's just runs his lab and is brilliant. And I have no idea what his physique looks like, but I know I can hardly read his papers because they're so complex.
Right.
And I know he used to be a bodybuilder. And sometimes you get so drawn into your science that you don't have the time to dedicate to lifting like you once did. And it's just an intentional focus.
Right.
So I think we all have to respect each other's journey and realize that, you might have loved training at one point, but maybe you just can't dedicate it the same way as you used to. The same goes for me. Like mentoring students is my number one priority. I still train, but I can't train the same as I used to. And my girlfriend's a bikini competitor, and we're both so busy. The only time I can train is with her. So I'm doing a bikini girl workout like for the past 2 years. And that's just life, right? And I'm cool with it. And but yeah, I've had people. I can think of a few people on podcasts that made fun of my research and used how I looked as a way to critique my research. And these were other scientists.
Right. See, here's the thing. I would never point to the way someone looks as a reason not to listen to them, as long as they weren't being absolute in their speech.
Yeah.
If you say, I have the best technique, and this guy over here that's a monster just did it by accident because of steroids, you're basically speaking in absolute terms. And if you don't have the evidence to back it up other than a paper, that becomes difficult. So that's the only, and like I said this on a previous podcast, the look of a person doesn't matter, because like Hani Rambod is a 25-time winning Olympia coach.
Yeah.
Hani competed before, had a nice physique, but he doesn't have a nice physique now. But he has a body of work that he can point to and say, I have a lot of reasons why you should listen to me. Whereas it's not just a paper. So it's
Yeah.
not necessarily the way somebody looks. It's show me some evidence other than what you did in a lab.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that evidence is greatly exaggerated. You know, I read some papers that I thought you guys might want to talk about today, but for example, the paper that looked at, I think, RIR, like training to failure or training with 1 rep in reserve or 2 reps in reserve. That was a paper, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, with 18 people in it. A lot of coaches that work with athletes have trained hundreds, if not, I'm sure there's coaches that have worked with thousands of people. That's a form of science because they're trying things, they're looking at the result, and then they're changing what they do to elicit a different outcome.
Right.
So I think a lot of coaches are employing a form of the scientific method. It's just not overseen by a university, and it
Right.
doesn't have maybe the same level of control, and you can't publish it in the same way. But I have these discussions all the time. You know, when Holly's competing and she's evidence based, and she'll try to, her feedback from the judges was to bring up her glutes. And so she's like, okay, well, what does the evidence say? Well, the evidence says somewhere after 30 sets, there's a plateau in muscle growth of what you can achieve. And I said, but also, none of the studies are training how you train. The people in the studies don't have your genetics for muscle growth.
Right.
And the majority of the individuals in these studies are nowhere near where you are in your training career.
Right.
When you're really pushing the boundaries of muscle growth, like you're trying to force an adaptation that your body doesn't want, right?
Sure.
James' body doesn't want to get bigger
Right.
because that's a strain, that's a stress.
Right.
And so you're almost forcing something that's pretty unnatural. And I don't know that you can always take studies as a direct reflection of how you should train when you're at that level. I think the basic ideas train close to or near failure with sufficient volume. But
So can we get into more of an overview before we get, I know I got like 6 or 7 topics here that you wanted to discuss that I want to get into, but just as an overview on
yeah,
this, and you just touched on it a little bit. When someone says I have a study or I read this study, I read that study, whether it's on nutrition or training or whatever, I think you touched on the most important part. They're in these studies, are they being very specific in that these are, you know, advanced training individuals? Are they beginners? They're 60 years old, they're 20 years old. Like when people are reading these studies, are they taking those things into account? And are the studies even taking those factors into account?
Um, so the majority of studies are in college age individuals, and typically that's 18 to 35. And that's just a convenience thing, right? The
Sure.
people that are around me here at the university are generally 18 to 35 years old.
Yeah.
Then most studies are either in untrained individuals, so people who don't currently resistance trained,
Yeah.
so research in untrained individuals, or studies in trained individuals, which is typically defined as having engaged in resistance training for at least 6 months. Some studies will use at least 1 year. Some labs will say have been resistance training and have a minimum strength level of sometimes you'll see 1.5 times body weight on the back squat. It's like a
Sure.
strength criteria.
Mhm.
In my lab, you know, I often like study things in a bicep curl model. So I study people's biceps. I put their biceps through different protocols and see how they grow. For me, the way to get the most specific is if I'm doing a bicep curl as an exercise and I want resistance trained people, it's you had to have been doing that exercise and training that specific muscle, sometimes with a certain frequency and intensity.
Mhm.
Because if you're targeting the muscle and the muscle can grow, it should have already grown.
Right.
So when you want to study a trained person, the hope is if you've been training for 2 years, well, how much of the growth that you can achieve is already achieved?
Right.
So growth is going to be harder to facilitate.
Right.
The other important thing is most studies are 6 weeks, 8 weeks, or 12 weeks long. And this is probably the most massive limitation of research because what can you really see in 6 or 8 weeks?
Exactly.
But it's just because the semester schedule in school, you have to finish a study by spring break in the spring. You have to finish a study by Thanksgiving break or Christmas break in the fall because your students leave.
Um, so would it be safe to say that when you have these this generation of TikTok kids pointing to all these studies and looking at and trying to espouse protocols for advanced lifters, would it be safe to say that that doesn't really make any sense? Because it sounds like from what you're telling me, if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like what you're telling me is most of the studies are not done on guys like me and James, or even remotely close to where me and James are.
Yeah, there might be one or two people occasionally in a study that are like you and James, but the vast majority of people in these studies are definitely not like you and James. When I say like you and James, probably close to your upper limit of muscle growth.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, they are resistance trained for the general population.
James, do you have any questions on an overview of like people bringing studies forward and what they might mean, or like
No, not really. I
why
was
it's
just
so popular?
again, like referring back to what we were talking before, it's like an authoritative thing in the times that we live in, isn't it? It's just because everyone wants to be in a position of authority.
Yeah.
It comes down to not much more than that. But like what you say there with the study lengths as well, like, 6, 8, 12 weeks. Obviously that's great information, and it's great for who you are assessing and what you are assessing. And it's still viable, and it still has application in certain areas on certain individuals. So it shouldn't be like looked upon even by people like ourselves like it's pointless, because it's not pointless. It's just that the kind of the scope of who it is, who it kind of applies to is just obviously slightly different. It'd be interesting, wouldn't it, if you actually did studies of those kind of longer periods with people who are further in their training years, who are
Yeah.
closer to maxed out muscle, and seeing what actual occurrences happen and what studies you could find from that. It would be interesting.
Would it be safe to say also, if people brought studies forward and said, look, this could help your training, but it's not an absolute, because there's so many variables, right? Whether it be
Mhm.
advanced, like how far into your training you are, or how long you've been training, or whatever. Like all of these things are variables that you've described in a study. So if people are going to submit a study as evidence for something, they could say, look, this could help you in your training, but we're not saying it's the full-blown evidence.
That's probably most studies. Like most studies can maybe shift things in a direction.
Right.
But the language I like to see when people communicate them is based on this, I would tend to think this.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's how scientists typically talk,
Okay.
right? A new study will come up and show, well, this exercise was a little bit better than that exercise. For example, the seated calf raise wasn't as good as the standing calf raise in one of these recent papers.
Sure.
And the difference in muscle growth will be pretty small. And like I'll read it and I won't be compelled at all by that data. Another
That's
person will read it and
yeah.
their mind will be blown. So
That's what I want to ask you about, because I think that's what people are doing.
yeah,
This is what I say, and maybe I don't know if this was one of your topics, but we can get into this.
yeah.
And you said this about being people over exaggerating or talking too compellingly about certain things. I watch a lot of Lane Norton,
Hmm.
and I feel like Lane does a pretty good job. I don't know if you do. I don't know if you want to speak specifically to any one person, but I feel like Lane does a pretty good job of saying that, in that, yeah, there's a minor difference here and there. I guess what I'm talking about is, let's use your example of the standing versus seated calf raise. Let's say standing is showing 0.1 grams of muscle more after 3 months or 1 month or whatever. Does anybody really give a shit? Like, is that really anything?
But that's what he says. There are those small.
No, but I'm saying, is that
you know,
really anything to point to? Like, it's not. First of all, there's two things about that. First of all, most guys are going to do a number of exercises when it comes to calves anyway.
mhm.
Second of all, are we really going to, like, I guess what I'm trying to ask you, Samuel, is the evidence compelling enough to even worry about? Like, is it even anything worth, or are people just really trying to dig for the sake of digging?
Yeah, so I won't claim to be right. I'll just show you my thoughts because I know some people will disagree.
Mhm.
But I made some posts on this because this was the first time I ever saw science doing this. This is like the last 2 or 3 years I've seen these developments.
Sure.
So they do a muscle growth study, and let's say, so the way I think about muscle growth is in centimeters.
Okay.
So we measure muscle and muscle thickness. So we'll take an image and measure from the bone to the muscle fat interface.
Okay.
So like the average bicep is around 4 centimeters thick.
Okay.
The average muscle growth you'll see over time, like let's say 8 weeks in the bicep, is zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.2 centimeter increase in muscle thickness.
Okay.
And our ability as scientists to measure that change is not that good. Generally, we can say your muscle grew or your muscle didn't grow.
Sure.
What I've seen recently, and this is the majority of the science content that y'all are seeing. I don't have TikTok, but I see it on Instagram. A study will see zero point 0.1 centimeters of growth in one group, and they'll see 0.15 centimeters of growth in the other group. Now, me as a scientist, zero point 0.1 versus 0.15, that's the same. Like you cannot measure 0.05 centimeters with ultrasound. You can measure the same image twice
Yeah.
and get that big of a difference.
Right.
But what they're doing now is so going from 4 to 4.1 and going from 4 to 4.15. I don't know what percent increase that is in each group, but let's just say it's a 5% and a 5% increase, a 5% and a 5.1% increase.
I know where you're going.
So if you're honest, you'd say a 0.1% better in this group. It's not super meaningful. What the scientist, and this is, I can't believe the scientists are now doing this, but they're influencers now, so they have to.
Yeah.
Zero point 0.1 versus 0.15. What they're saying on social media is 50% more growth if you do this
Right.
exercise versus that exercise.
Right. Right.
Yeah, it's trickery, really, isn't it? Essentially, it's kind of
Well, yeah.
it's advertisement, and it's not, it's not true. There's some truth to it, but it's the exaggeration that's the
No,
kind
no.
of issue we're facing.
James, it's true. It's 100% true.
Yeah, but it's the exaggeration, though. It's the way that it's
Listen,
because the untrained ear
Yeah.
hears 50% more muscle growth, and they assume that will continue as a trend.
Look, the
So,
reason I understand this is because it happens in the supplement world all the time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
a company will put, and this isn't a percentage thing. I mean, it happens in percentages too, but as far as like the efficacy of something, but like even something as simple as they'll put 30 scoops on the front of a label instead of putting 30 servings,
Yeah,
because a full serving it's 2 scoops.
yeah.
So that means there's actually only 15 servings.
But then the consumer.
They'll put 30 scoops, so the person thinks I'm getting 30 servings. So like, it's not that it's untrue. It's just they're mincing words.
You work within. It's the same with a lot of pre-workouts as well, with like the 2 scoop, 1 scoop thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they have the 2 serving portions on there, and no one's ever going to take the 1 serving portion because it's slightly underdosed. It's not efficacious.
Right.
So it's only like maybe a bikini chick that might do 1 scoop because they're not really that fussed. But yeah, any person that's actually aware of what they're taking, they know they need a certain level of beta-alanine, a certain level of citrulline, and therefore the 2 scoops is always what you're going to do. But the tub says 40 servings, even though it's only
That's my
20.
point. Yeah, that's my point. So anyway, so going back to your
Yeah.
point, Samuel, I get it. So they're mincing words to make the study seem much greater than it is, and it's compelling a whole generation of kids to change their way of thinking.
It's unbelievable. And I've been more vocal. Like again, I don't really have a platform and I'm not good at making content, but I comment when I can. And it's funny, like I'm a PhD, I'm pretty good at this stuff. I do a lot of research, but it doesn't matter if you're not an influencer, they'll say, well, such and such says this, and it's like there's not much you can do. So like I wrote a review paper on I'm sure you guys have heard about all this range of motion and training at long muscle lengths that it kind of exploded. And I think there's been some backtracking, at least a little bit, but I still see the content. I made some comments on some posts, and the people that were propping this up and creating this message, they know me,
Yeah.
but they blocked me.
Right.
They removed me from the conversation.
Right.
And it's like, I'm a scientist here. Like I think I need to be part of the conversation.
Right.
I would hope you let me be part of the conversation. But a lot of these science influencers, I don't know if it's out of insecurity of, being called out by, there's very few people that can actually call the scientists out based on evidence.
Right. Right.
But the scientists that I've talked to, similar things have happened where almost to continue a narrative, they get rid of the conversation by people that can have the conversation. And it's not to say you guys can't be part of the conversation, but like there's almost this authority that comes with being a PhD for better or for worse.
Yeah.
Right? That you can actually challenge somebody on the claim that they're making. And to be removed from the conversation was a shame. But I say all that to say the way I've tried to counter is just publish research, which
Yeah.
it
Well,
takes longer for that to make an impact.
I think one of the ways you can counter is by coming on my podcast more, because this is probably one of the bigger platforms in the industry. And I would love to have you come on and not be against science, but actually tell people the truth about the science.
Yeah.
And I know you don't want to name names, but I will name names. Mike Israetel was on my podcast, and I'm not a PhD, so we got into a pretty heated debate about range of motion. And my philosophy is always active range of motion is more important than full range of motion. So obviously the lengthened portion of the muscle has to be there because you want to stretch it out as much as possible, obviously without
Exaggerating.
not exaggerating or putting any extra strain on your joints. But anyway, so we got in this pretty big debate, and it's, the podcast is still up. People can go watch it. Pretty big debate about full range and active range. And I think Mike has kind of shifted since then back to more of the long range is the more important part, or the stretched portion is more important, which is what the science shows now, which to me is what bodybuilders have been doing for the last 30 years, as far as I'm concerned.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But this is kind of the thing, is like, he's having this debate with me. I can't have the debate because I don't have a science background.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm left to anecdotal evidence in my arguments, which to a listener is not compelling.
For
You're
sure.
sitting with somebody who has evidence and somebody who doesn't, except for their own experience.
Yeah.
Which doesn't sound great because, well, this guy took steroids and this guy did this and this guy did that. So his evidence probably isn't as valid as this other person's evidence. But what I would like to do is, if I can get Mike to come on with you and we can have like a real debate and we can have like a real conversation about his thoughts or your thoughts, and I'm not trying to make this like a you against him, or I'm not just talking about Mike. I'm talking about anybody
Yeah.
who
And
wants,
Well, it's like you said. It's the problem is when the discussions are blocked.
yeah,
Like you said there, like you get cancelled out the conversation. That's why there's a problem. If everyone just has a conversation, then you're always free to choose which way you choose to follow your training or whatever you want to apply to. When you cancel someone else, and then there is no opportunity to hear all sides, that's when there's a problem, because you can someone who doesn't agree with you isn't your enemy.
right.
If you can talk, but it's when you block them, they are your enemy. So it kind of creates that hostility within the industry, which kind of really isn't necessary.
Samuel, do you want to get into a couple of these? I think we covered kind of social media and science in general.
Yeah.
I want to cover RIR really quick. You touched on that earlier. For people who don't know what that is, it's reps in reserve, meaning leaving some reps in the tank on each set.
Yeah.
Can you, there's been a really huge push lately for RIR and fatigue management. Like, I'm seeing this shit like constantly come up.
Yeah.
Can you touch a little bit on why the emphasis on these things has become so prevalent and why people are so scared to overtrain as if it's really easy to do?
Yeah. Coming up with why it's happening, that one's a mystery to me. I think maybe people just have their different philosophies,
Right.
and ways of thinking based on, who they came up under, who they studied under, or who mentored them. And actually wrote a paper on this as well. Rio Kataoka, one of my former students, is the lead author. And I listened to this whole pod, and this is back. So my story, I used to listen to science-based podcasts, and then I got so frustrated. I think that's why I started listening to your podcast, Fouad. I did a podcast with a former student that had Luke Sandow on, and I listened to his episode. I liked his episode, so I think that's how I stumbled upon yours.
Sure.
And it was refreshing to listen to people talk about training, but it didn't really feel like it was coming from a place of ego or authority.
Right.
Right. But anyway, I listened to like a 3-part podcast on fatigue. And specifically, they were talking about fatigue accumulation. So this is like 3.5 hours of podcasting I'm listening to. And I'm waiting for when they explain what's accumulating. Right. So if fatigue accumulates, what's accumulating? I think that's a really important question.
Yeah, there has to be
So something has to be building up, right? And the only thing that was ever said was building up was they just kept using the word to explain it, fatigue. I was like, okay, well, when we talk about fatigue in our textbooks or if you read papers, fatigue is a metabolic byproduct, lactic acid, hydrogen ions, these things that our muscle produces when it contracts. Well, these are cleared, when you're walking through the grocery store after your session. Like they're cleared by the time you're home.
Yep.
Fatigue is also explained by a depletion of something. So you deplete your
Replenish.
energy, your ATP, your PCR, your glycogen. Well, that doesn't accumulate. So it's the fatigue accumulation thing I went down. We wrote a whole paper on this. We couldn't really identify anything to point to
Yeah.
that really strongly said, okay, you're accumulating fatigue. That doesn't mean it doesn't occur,
Right.
but mechanistically, it's hard to point to anything.
Can I?
Um,
Do you
Sorry,
think it's more of a, because I feel like when people would use that term, I normally think that when you speak to that individual, what you'll realize is that they're coming to a point in their mind where they're growing tired of the routine. So therefore, it's not necessarily. I find it's not. There's not physical fatigue. There's mental tiredness that's
yeah,
occurring because of bodybuilding being so regimented and so mundane that you grow tired of the routine, and that's when I think people are like, "Oh, I'm fatigued."
yeah.
That's just an add to the conversation. I don't know what your opinion is on that.
No, I definitely think the psychological aspect is really important, and it's probably connected.
Mm,
But if you look at the data, like so they call it, I mean, I guess you guys know about overtraining. And
yes.
scientifically, they've tried to induce overtraining in studies. And there's this guy named Andy Fry. And Andy Fry, I think it was his dissertation was an overtraining study. And the first time he ever did it, he couldn't induce overtraining. Like they're having people do several 1RMs every single day.
mm.
And the first study failed to produce overtraining. The second study actually did, but they did 10 1RM back squats every single day for like
Just for
2 weeks
people,
straight.
just for people watching, one RM is a one rep max.
Oh
Yeah,
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 yeah.
Sorry,
So
I just want to
imagine
parse everything else so everybody watching knows
yeah.
what we're talking about.
that's good thinking.
So for
So
Um,
10 days in a row of 1 rep max squat,
yeah, but 10 reps each
10
time.
reps each
Ooh,
time. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
10 rep max
And they finally
squat.
saw a continued depression of strength, which they termed overtraining.
Okay.
But to me, that demonstrates that it's pretty hard to get there,
Yeah,
even when you intentionally try to induce it.
right.
But what I think science is now perpetuating is like if you go from 2 reps in reserve to 1 rep in reserve, or you accidentally train to failure, it's like, oh crap, well, you're screwed. You know,
Okay.
Your
like
whole
you're in
session
big
was a
trouble.
waste. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and that I don't really understand. I think we need to look to our sleep, our recovery, our nutrition.
Yes.
If we're truly getting to the point where things are just going downhill, yeah, you could be doing too much, but I don't think it's because your reps in reserve are one or two different.
Sam,
Yeah.
can I go back and I want to parse this out a little bit because it's
Yeah,
important. So when you talk about fatigue, you said two things. There's either a buildup of something or a depletion of something.
classically, yeah.
That's how you would measure it, right?
Yeah,
So when I hear fatigue, I hear the same thing you think. I hear overtraining. These people are using the term fatigue because maybe it sounds cool nowadays. I don't know. We used to just say overtraining. I'm overtrained. I need a rest, whatever.
yeah.
To me, overtraining is, I've always thought of it two ways. Either I did too much in a session, and what you said for the inducing overtraining actually doesn't sound like a lot to me.
Okay.
Like I'm used to doing I've had people on the podcast like Roman Fritz who does two workouts a day that are like
Yeah.
30 working sets each.
What I'll add to that though, Fuad,
Yes.
is I think it's the fact that it's the same exercise effort.
Yeah, over and over
Do
again.
you
You're
think?
right.
Do you think that? Do you think
Yeah,
that's?
yeah,
Yeah, I think that
yeah.
because, like you say, typically there's bodybuilders that train 6 days a week.
Right, right, right. And then but
But
they
if
cycle through.
cycling through
Yeah, yeah.
the physical side.
So I guess what I was touching on though is so let's say that was the thing that did the overtraining, which I guess James makes sense. It's every day. Um, I always looked at it as just you're depleting glycogen from the muscle. And you've depleted so much glycogen, and now the muscle's kind of empty. And
Mhm.
that's where the loss of strength comes from. And that's where the symptoms of overtraining come from, which is loss of strength, loss of pump, maybe overly tired because you're not sleeping right because your body's so depleted of nutrients. So this is kind of like where overtraining comes in for me. So I guess what my point of all this is saying is, are people even getting close to that? Because if you're eating right, like if you're eating what you should be eating and you're sleeping the way you should be sleeping and you're taking your supplements or taking steroids, whatever you're taking, it's probably pretty hard to get there.
I would think. I have this section in my class where we try to like uncover different things that could explain fatigue. And um, if you look at the protocols I use to induce like complete like glycogen depletion. What they do is they have people cycle on a bike with just one of their legs.
Okay.
And it's on a really high intensity for like 3 hours continuously.
Right.
And if you cycle on a bike with one leg at a high intensity for 3 hours continuously, you will nearly deplete your glycogen.
Yeah.
But it's almost completely replenished within 24 to 48 hours.
This is it.
Okay.
You
So
know,
can you explain to me then, and I'll leave it to you to explain to me what overtraining is. If you said, because you said if there's a buildup of lactic acid and other things that is cleared pretty quickly from the body,
Mhm.
but then you also said even the depletion is kind of refilled pretty quickly. So what is overtraining when someone feels overtrained? Because there is a real thing, like overtraining is a real thing.
Yeah.
So what is that? What is happening from your studies?
Yeah. And to be clear, I don't study overtraining. I've just read on overtraining. So this is coming from my reading and I guess just what I think. I think it might be a constant cycle of training too much and not sleeping enough, not getting your nutrition, so you're not fully recovered when you train next time. I think it could be a like constant muscle damage and then getting more muscle damage, and your body pretty robustly protects itself. But have you guys heard the term central fatigue? So like this idea that
Central CNS.
yeah, CNS fatigue.
Yeah, this is what I was going to actually ask. So this leads into this, yeah. So
Yeah. So again, something I'm not an expert on, and I've done in the papers and tried to better understand central fatigue and how people measure it. Well, how people measure it is, if you contract your muscle, and then I shock your nerve, and your muscle can exert more force than what you can voluntarily express, you're not able to activate all of your muscle right now, right? So there are instances where, and most of these studies are short term, 24 to 48 hours. Voluntary activation is not back to baseline, meaning James might be strong, but he can't express all of his strength at that moment.
Right.
Now, I would tend to think that it's probably due to inflammation in your connective tissue, and your muscles communicate with your brain, right? If James quads, if they are at risk for injury, wouldn't it make sense that you decrease your ability to activate that muscle to
Right.
protect yourself from injuring yourself? So,
sure.
what I actually think it is maybe some injury in the muscle, or maybe just under recovery, and you're communicating that with the brain, and the brain is maybe limiting your ability to produce force because it wants more
So
recovery.
it's a safety mechanism essentially.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay, so
and I
let
could be
me,
talking on my ass.
no, it's
Again, I don't
okay.
study this. These are my thoughts based on some
Well,
things I've read.
me and Fouad could correlate that the days that we feel tender are probably the days sometimes when we've gone in the gym and haven't been able to lift perhaps what we know we could lift. You got tender chest, you go in the gym, you
Yeah.
try to do incline barbell, you're 2 reps shy of what you normally do, and you're like, oh fuck, I knew that was going to happen.
Yeah.
There's an association with damage and maybe, like you say, the body. It's not necessarily the damage that's preventing you from being able to lift that weight. From what you're saying, it's more so that the brain is saying, okay, there is recovery trying to occur. We probably shouldn't exert at full capacity,
Right.
Yeah,
which would make
I
sense
get
as well because the body's intelligent, isn't it?
I guess what I'm asking, I'm going to play devil's advocate then, Sam.
sure.
He does that a
So
lot.
you're telling me overtraining is real. Obviously, we kind of already knew that, and you're telling me that the buildup and the depletion and all that kind of gets your body can take care of it on its own. But you're also telling me that with a central fatigue, your body can kind of not perform the same way. So devil's advocate, like what the evidence-based community or science-based or these new generation of kids that are espousing fatigue management, they would say that's all the same thing. Should I just do more reps in reserve then, so that I don't fatigue as quickly and I don't enter that phase that you're talking about?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, and maybe that would be a way to avoid it. Um, I just don't know that I believe that let's say you do 8 exercises. So, and let's say you do three sets per exercise. Those 3 reps in each exercise are the difference between that occurring and that not occurring.
I see what you're saying.
So I mean, maybe I'm wrong, and I don't think there's good evidence to point to. Training to failure made this huge of a difference. I think it's more the total amount that you're performing,
But I was
the
just
total
gonna,
amount of volume. Are you in the gym for 2 hours, 3 hours, or are you training for an hour and a half? How many exercises per muscle group? I think those might be more important than proximity to failure.
I have a question after you, Fouad. Do you think?
well, I was just going to say that if you look at it cumulatively, I might have to side with them then, because if you're saying to me there's 8 exercises, you said, and 3 sets each, so you're doing 24 sets.
Yeah. I think if you're doing that much volume, though, is it all the same muscle group for y'all, or would that be
Oh, no,
different
okay,
muscle
well,
groups?
let's just reduce it to a normal workout. If you're doing chest, you're doing 4 exercises.
Yeah, 16 sets, maybe.
Yeah, you're doing 16 sets, right? 16 sets. And then on all 16 sets, you reduce, you do 3 reps in reserve. So you've now reduced it to what, 32, 48. You've taken 48 reps
Away from
off the tank and not gone to failure on those sets. Isn't that enough to
still
manage
stimulating.
fatigue? Like, wouldn't that make a difference? Or is 48 reps nothing?
I wouldn't say it's nothing. Especially those reps. I mean, those are going to be your slowest reps.
Right, the last reps. Yeah.
Yeah, I certainly think it's possible. I think it also is maybe important to think about what exercise, right? If it's
Right.
a hack squat or
Yeah.
a back
It's a
squat or
compound
a
movement.
big muscle group, it's probably a lot more meaningful. Whereas I don't think you're ever at risk of bicep curl to failure yourself into overtraining.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to tell you this ahead of time. I actually think it's very, very hard to get to the point of overtraining if you're eating and sleeping properly.
Yeah.
And you got your split set up properly so that you have enough rest. I'm just playing devil's advocate, because if I was one of these people that was holding on to this like fatigue management thing, I would say that 48 reps at the end of a leg workout is probably a big saver for me to be able to go back and train legs 3 days later.
Yeah.
Now, this is the question is now, because of the purpose of what we do, would that session yield the response that is desired? The fact that you want muscle growth, that you want adaptation to occur, because can you accumulate enough? Can you do enough accumulative with reps in reserve to still cause the body to adapt? Because I do kind of believe you can, because let's say you have an injury, for example, in a certain body part. I've always kind of challenged that muscle by trying to find a different way where perhaps I can't go to failure because of the integrity of the joint.
Right.
So therefore, I accumulate more volume over the session by being smart. And I've noticed that the body part hasn't necessarily faded or got worse. The question is, can it progress? You know,
I kind of had the same question James had, is if we're not testing that limit of adaptation because we're cutting it 3 reps short, can we still achieve the same level of growth? Has that study been done, or do you have any knowledge about that?
But yeah, that study came out in 2024. And what these authors did is they trained with 1 rep in reserve, 2 reps in reserve, or to failure. And I have the details somewhere here. It was Ruffalo was the author's name. But anyway, they saw similar muscle growth between all of these groups. And I forget how many, they were resistance trained, if I remember correctly. I have it right here.
so previous exposure to training.
Yeah. But so again, this is why I think the details are important, especially for y'all when you decide, okay, how much do I care about this data? You take trained people, they're training twice a week. And in reality, they're doing, probably 2 or 3 exercises. So this particular paper, they based their training volume, so how many sets they were doing, based on how many sets they reported when they came into the study. So they'd say, James, how many sets are you doing for your quads? And they tried to match that. So that's kind of cool. And then they had them train to failure with 1 rep in reserve or 2 reps in reserve. A critique I might have of this paper, though, is like if there is a small difference between 1 rep in reserve and 2 reps in reserve and failure, I don't think you can measure it over 8 weeks.
Yeah.
And this is purely a researcher's perspective who researches muscle growth. I think the difference would be very small.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'm going to capture it. So even if it does exist.
Can I also point to one other thing that might be a flaw in this whole study?
Yeah.
Everybody's version of failure is different. I've trained with a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I've trained with guys who their version of failure is like you put a gun to their head and they can't do another rep.
There's others that
And I've trained with other guys that are like their version of failure is like, that guy could probably get 3 more.
Yeah.
So you also are trusting the person doing the set to say that this was failure or not. When I don't think a lot of people actually know where their failure point is because they've never trained with a person that can take them there.
Yeah. You'd have to have very specific.
Go ahead, James.
Sorry, I'm just very picturing this you'd have to have very military
Yeah.
a military format where
Yeah.
you almost don't like the people you're putting through the procedure,
Yeah.
and literally trying to break them to know
Right.
failure was being occurred. You know.
Yeah, because it's like, look, I'm a huge proponent in you only train as hard as the hardest person you've ever trained with. Because once you're exposed to somebody that trains hard, you're like, holy shit, I didn't realize that that's how far I could go.
Yeah.
So there might be some kid out there that's never trained with anybody really hard, and he thinks he knows what failure is.
Levels here.
Then you put him in the gym with somebody like a fucking like Ben, and he kills them, and he's like, oh my God, I didn't realize I had 5 more reps on every single thing. So
Yeah.
we're looking at this study, but is that a flaw in that kind of study? Because how do you measure someone's failure versus somebody else's?
Yeah, it's a limitation. So I wouldn't say it's a fundamental flaw. I think you can still take something away from the study.
Okay.
And it's a within subject design, which means, and I'm pretty sure if I'm remembering correctly, it meant one arm trained one way and the other arm trained the other way or other leg. Um, that may or may not be correct. But if it's the same person, how you perceive things should be
I guess.
consistent.
Yeah, yeah,
You know
yeah.
what I mean?
Right, right.
So like that helps with that limitation just a little bit. But I think what you said is absolutely true. There's been research that tries to look at people's ability to, let's say, predict where their failure is at, and then have them train to the point where they can't get another rep. So like, let's see how accurate you are at predicting
Yeah.
were you actually 2 reps from failure. And it's definitely true that people have different amounts of, we used to call it grit when we were
Yeah.
doing research. Like
Yeah,
some
yeah,
people,
we say that.
Yeah.
like there's some people that just didn't have any grit.
Yeah.
One of the funniest things I ever had happen was it was a chest press exercise, a hammer strength chest press we were doing for the study, and we told people to train to failure. Well, we had somebody fail on the way down. They got so on the eccentric, they're lowering the weight. Like,
Yeah.
I'm stuck. But you can't fail on the eccentric.
Kill in these countries.
You just have to lower the weight. Um, and it, the participant was great. I'm thankful for their time, but it's a memory that someone failed when you couldn't fail there in the rep.
You just keep going down. That's it. Yeah.
But you see everything in research, and the researchers, there has to be some trust, right? That okay, these research they train, they have trained, and they know how to push people. They're paying attention and they care enough,
Yeah.
Right.
because when you're training a bunch of people all day and you have to count every rep and you have to ask them how they feel after each set, it gets monotonous. So you have to have some trust that the research team is doing things
So
correctly. And
let's go back because we kind of went off on a tangent here. So there was 2 things you were going to tell me. One was they did a study on reps in reserve, and were you going to? What was the end?
muscle growth is the same.
Yeah.
It was all the same.
Yeah. Muscle growth is the same.
So the failure guys, the 1 rep in reserve, the 2 reps in reserve, the muscle growth was all the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, if that's the truth, then let's say that's 100% accurate, regardless of all the variables. If that's the truth, then wouldn't you want to train with 2 reps in reserve? Because now you're like, I'm more fresh for tomorrow or the day after, the day after that.
Yeah, I think so. And it depends on how you use science. I'm a scientist, but I don't take absolute takeaways. It's like, okay, in general, muscle growth is going to be pretty similar.
Right.
And sometimes I ask people, well, do you want to hedge your bets? Like, do you think that maybe, like I said, if there is a difference, the difference is small, and I don't think the current scientific tools that we use, the sample sizes that we recruit, I don't think we can show it. But like Holly, again, my girlfriend that's training and wants to get to Olympia, it's like, okay, do we put our full trust in the science, or do we do we say, you know what, I think there might be a small effect here that they're not able to capture in these studies,
Right.
and I'm going to go outside where the data is currently because I just don't think the data is there yet. And I think y'all should be able to do that. And I think the science purist would get on and say, no, these bodybuilders are wrong. This isn't going to lead to any better. Here's the data.
Right.
And oftentimes the people on the other side of the argument aren't equipped to say, okay, yeah, that's the data, but what are the limitations of the data?
Right.
And, how much weight can you put in this evidence?
Well, the other thing too is I want to ask you is, let's say they do this study, right? And they do it for 8 weeks, was it? 12 weeks?
8 weeks.
So they take a few advanced people and they put them through 8 weeks. And they say, you know what? There's a minor difference, if any at all. First of all, what if you extrapolate that out for 10 years?
That's where I
right?
believe.
Like, what if the guy that trained to failure gained, like you said, 0.05 centimeters on the muscle?
Non-readable in the moment of that
Yeah,
short period.
non-readable in
Yeah,
the 8 weeks, right?
Yeah.
What about over 8 years?
Yeah.
Right now, does that make a difference? And that's kind of where I come from, because I'm like, okay, you didn't replicate what we're thinking in your 8 week study, but I have 40 years of bodybuilders
yeah,
say otherwise. So that's kind of like, I've always looked at bodybuilding as science in that regard, in that we're all doing this experiment every day.
Yeah.
And so when I look over the last century of bodybuilding, or half century, I think to myself, failure, all these guys trained to failure, and it induced these type of results. Not you personally, but you in an 8 week study told me that there was barely no difference.
Yeah.
Well, is the study long enough? Is the study, like, you know what I mean? Like, there's so many variables to it.
Yeah.
And if you said to me there was no difference, what exactly is the difference? Is it 0.05? Because what does 0.05 after 8 weeks look like after 8 years?
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's kind of where I get frustrated with it. I'm like, but what about all the stuff that we've seen already?
Yeah, and that's the nuance I think that's lacking in scientific communication online. The caution and just the skepticism. So
Right.
like science should always be cautious and skeptical, and it should always doubt itself, in my opinion. Like I'll give you an example. We did a study in my lab where we tried to pre-fatigue the muscle by, so you guys heard of blood flow restriction?
Yes.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
Did it
fine,
for a
yeah.
while.
occasionally we do blood flow restriction studies in my lab. My mentor's mentor brought it to the United States from Japan. So we like to do studies occasionally. And I realize you never need to use BFR. Like if you have an injury and you can't lift
Injury is
heavy,
great.
it's helpful.
That's when I used it, when I had injuries.
Yeah,
John would actually have me use it.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's very
So
common for injury.
it's helpful in those scenarios, but like there's no scenario if you're healthy that you need to use BFR. So I wanted to try a protocol, and my idea was I'm gonna just inflate the cuff. And did you guys experience a lot of discomfort when you use BFR? Like,
I don't know.
It's not too bad, but yeah, it's obviously restrictive, and
Yeah.
you don't feel normal because obviously
I
it's
don't know if
kind
I
of.
had, yeah, maybe I didn't have the restriction on time.
I don't think we can ever get them tight enough because of the issues with obviously for someone putting a cuff around Fuad's arm in his heyday.
Yeah, but
You never get things to fit properly anyway.
oh
yeah,
yeah,
but
well
you're actually not,
Samson,
but you're not supposed to get it. Correct me if I'm wrong, Samuel, but I don't think you're supposed to get it tighter than like a 6 or 7. Like, you're not supposed to, like,
Yeah,
it's
how tight is it meant to be?
the,
yeah, you're supposed
from
to
what I was
restrict the
told.
blood, but not completely occlude the blood flow.
So
Right.
obviously the blood to get in, not yeah.
Yeah, and venous blood pressure is very low. Arterial blood pressure is really high.
Mm.
So like the venous pressure should be 10 or 15 millimeters of mercury, which is you don't need a lot of pressure to occlude your venous system. And what
Okay.
that means is blood gets in, but it can't get out.
Right.
Yeah.
So
So it
during
pulls
your
away.
rest periods, you're bathing the muscle in its own metabolites. So
Okay.
basically, you're able to more rapidly fatigue your muscle and reach failure so you can make that set effective, even though
Yeah.
the weight's light,
Yeah.
whatever.
Sure.
So we inflated a cuff before lifting heavy. So you don't typically use it with heavy weight. And we just did sets of 3. And my idea was let's try to make those 3 reps like the last 3 reps of a set by just pre-fatiguing the muscle by bathing it in its own metabolites. And we didn't see muscle growth. Like we tried it and it didn't work. And that's the finding. Like the study didn't work. It wasn't effective.
Yeah. How
But
long
when
was your study? How long was your study? How long
that
did you
was
do
an
it?
eight. No, yeah, it was an 8-week study.
Okay, cool.
But when I had a student presented at a conference, and I've presented a few times at different places, I always say like I still like this idea, and I think with little tweaks it could work. And I like even with my own data, I doubt it, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It does.
And when I talk about it and discuss it, I'm like, we saw this. I don't know that we're right. I think people should replicate this. And I'd like different eyes on it and different views. On social media, and again, it's probably the nature of how we have to communicate things. It has to be absolute. Here's the takeaway. Here's what we now know. And
Right.
science can prove this.
Right.
And like most of the time, that's not the case.
Right. Samuel, I wanted to touch on something. It's not one of your points, but it's a point that I wanted to touch on just in case you have knowledge in it, which I'm sure you do. So we kind of covered RIR and fatigue. I want to get into pump versus strength.
Okay.
So when people talk about hypertrophy,
Yeah.
they say mechanical tension is the main factor, meaning like how much you can lift, I guess. Would that be accurate?
Yeah.
Okay.
So how heavy the load is, how
How
heavy the
heavy the
weight's
load
on.
is.
Yeah. Mhm.
There are another factor though, which is the pump, which is what's the scientific term for that?
Sarcoplasmic, is it? Or was it?
The sarcoplasmic hypertrophy or the
Yeah,
I guess.
swelling?
yeah.
I guess
Cell swell, yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to use the right terms. But I guess
Which one?
earlier, I think training now in this generation seems to be driven by strength. The
Mhm.
load is what causes the muscle growth. That's what most people are espousing now online. If you look back to like my prime and earlier than my prime, maybe the 90s, even the 80s, even back to Arnold's era, the pump was
Essential.
it was very essential to everyone's trade. You have to get a pump. Your pump should be skin splitting. The bigger the pump you can get, the more muscle you can grow. It was kind of like these, but strength was also part of that. Like people still wanted to be strong.
Yeah.
It seems like people have discounted the pump completely now. So I just want you to explain to me, because I know it's part of muscle growth, but can you kind of parse out how important is it? Is it 5%? Is it 20%? Is it 50%?
Mhm.
Like, why do people think this is an important thing or not an important thing?
Yeah, so why people think it's important or not, it's probably associated with different types of training, I suppose, and people tend to get into camps on what type of training they think's effective. Um, Regarding the pump, like when you train, you get a fluid shift from outside of the cell into the cell, right? And this fluid shift typically brings with it amino acids, and some people think the swelling itself is anabolic, meaning that fluid shift causes your muscle to upregulate muscle protein synthesis.
Right.
I don't think that's the case because there are protocols that cause a lot of swelling that do not cause a lot of growth.
Yeah.
Aerobic exercise can cause swelling, but it doesn't cause, I mean, it can cause some growth, but it's not robust muscle growth. So there's a relationship. Every protocol that I'm aware of that does induce muscle growth induces some level of swelling, just because contraction
Yeah.
causes this fluid shift.
Sure.
But I don't know that chasing the pump is necessary, at least in the data that I'm aware of, right? But if you are chasing the pump, you're probably performing enough volume to induce muscle growth. So people that are chasing the pump are probably getting muscle growth, and people that aren't chasing the pump but are following guidelines for training are probably getting a pump.
Right.
Now, I think maybe why people think it means something is it just feels good, right? If your sleeves are tighter, you feel like you trained, and sometimes just that feedback that you did something and caused a change.
Well, can I? I'm just going to speak for myself, so we're not guessing, and then you can. I don't mind being the guinea pig for
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah.
I always, and you can, if I'm totally off, you can tell me I'm totally off. I'm admittedly a bro scientist, so I don't mind being wrong. I always thought the pump was important because it drove nutrients to the muscle, like you said, like it's going
Yeah.
to drive water, nutrients, hormones. Like you said, when you were talking about the blood flow restriction, it's going to bathe its own metabolites, these kind of
Mhm.
things. So I'm like, I thought that not by itself. Obviously, like you can't lift 10 pounds for 500 reps and get a pump and say, oh, look, my muscle's huge. Obviously, strength is a big component, if not a major component. But I thought it was a contributing factor. Like I
Mhm.
thought sending all of those nutrients and hormones or whatever, like to that muscle was a contributing factor. And this was a lot of the thinking behind insulin. Like guys would take
For
in,
sure.
like if somebody had a lagging body part, they would say, you know what? I'm going to take insulin on my quad day because my quads are lagging and it's going to send more water, more nutrients, and I'm
Mhm.
going to get a better pump in that muscle during that training session, which is also a lot of the theory behind intra-workout nutrition. Like if you take an intra-workout and there's carbs in it, those carbs are going to be driven to the muscle while you're training. And this is supposed to also aid in muscle growth.
Yeah.
So are all of these things just a facade? Like is all this false?
Yeah, I don't want to be arrogant enough to pretend I can answer all of your questions with like I don't think science can answer all of your questions. So I think that's you got to kind of like bro science because these ideas should lead to studies where we can test these things.
Sure.
And I don't think we've tested all of it. I will say there's not a dose response between how much you swell and how much you grow.
Okay.
So, but if you don't get any swelling, that could be a problem. So I do think swelling is important, but just to give you an example, if you do a set of 8 reps to failure, you're going to grow.
Sure.
If you do a set of 30 reps to failure, you will also grow, but you're going to get more swelling with the 30 reps versus the 8 reps because
Right.
more volume typically leads to more swelling.
Yeah.
So in this particular case, more swelling didn't lead to more growth. Now, does that mean your other examples don't lead to even more growth? Well, I can't speak to them because I'm not aware of any data.
That's fair.
I could make up something, but I simply don't know.
Can I just ask you, not speaking as a scientist, just maybe any type of background information you might have that's not an authority, but maybe that you've heard, or James, maybe your thoughts on it, because I know you've done this too. That theory of, and I'm using insulin as the most extreme example of this.
Yeah.
That theory of I'm going to take insulin on my bicep day because my biceps are shit.
Yeah.
Reason I thought people did that was because it drove more nutrients to the muscle cell while they were training because the insulin was help shuttling it. So they'd take like an intra workout with like 50 grams of carbs or something.
Aminos, all that stuff.
Plus the aminos, plus all that. And the theory was behind the bro science was that the insulin would shuttle those nutrients to the muscle you were training to either help it recover faster or whatever.
So just my thoughts for that to be true, then its natural ability to swell would have to limit its ability to grow at baseline, right? So
Explain.
your model to me suggests that getting more nutrient to the muscle is going to increase the growth response.
Just more swelling, more growth.
Yeah. So again, I'm just gonna
But it's not just
walk you through
but wait, it's not just swelling.
Yeah.
I'm saying you're actually feeding the muscle. I'm not saying we're just filling it with
But
water, right?
Yeah. But like I say, the byproduct of that is the hydration and the glucose and the
amino acids and all that.
Yeah.
Carry on, Sam. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Yeah, I'm just trying to walk you through how I'm thinking about it.
Sure.
For that to be true, and it could be true, I don't know.
Right.
Its natural ability to swell and get nutrients would have to be a limiting factor in that muscle's ability to grow. And I don't know that that's true. I know that if you do a certain amount of volume with sets to failure, if you look at muscle protein synthesis, it plateaus.
Okay.
So like, can you get more? And I think a lot of scientists speak about training and they want to push all their thoughts and ideas into the bodybuilding world where things are different, right?
Yeah.
Normal, like all the research we have is people with the governor on.
Yeah. Yeah, we have no limitations in our world.
Y'all are removing the governor. And
Absolutely.
there's so many instances where I think scientists need to say, I'm not really sure. Because with that governor removed, does more always lead to more?
Yeah.
It's possible. I don't think it'd have a big effect, but I guess it's possible it has some effect. And I don't know, that's not a satisfying answer
No, it
or
is.
response.
You know what's satisfying about it? It's satisfying to hear somebody say, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's the problem. That's what we're saying.
Yeah.
We're in a time where everyone's so absolute and confident on the surface that you're led to believe and go down certain avenues without discussion.
Yeah.
Well, because the thing is, Samuel, when you say I'm unsure, that leaves me to test it for myself. That means I can go into the gym and take 12 weeks using insulin. I'm not espousing insulin, by the way. I don't even like insulin use. I'm just saying that because
it's just hype.
Extreme way to shuttle nutrients.
Yeah.
I could take 8 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever and go to the gym and use insulin and use it on my lagging body part days and see what kind of growth I get. And then I can do another 12 weeks without it.
But that is bodybuilding, isn't it? That's
right,
our background.
Right.
It's always been that.
But what I'm saying is to have a scientist on that says, I haven't read a paper on that. I don't know what that would be. I don't think that study's been done. That's really refreshing because I'm like, that leaves the door open to say, hey, we're still learning. Other than you're fucking wrong. That makes no sense.
Yeah, for sure.
And the university would never let me do that study. So
of course,
in the United States and Canada, at least, you're never going to get that study out of academia. So it can only come from y'all.
Maybe we can do it in England.
Can we do it privately? Can we just give on a bunch of insulin and have you monitor him?
I'd still probably lose my job.
No, okay, no, I don't want you to lose. Okay, okay. So Sorry, one last thing before we move on from pump and strength. And we don't have a lot of time. We only have like 20. I have to go at 20 minutes, so I
Okay.
apologize.
Yeah.
We'll have to have you back on though, for sure.
Okay.
Just before we move on from pump and strength,
Yeah.
can you put a percentage on it? Like if you said there was a percentage of importance of the pump in hypertrophy, would you say it's 5%? Would you say it's not on the scale at all? Would you say it's just a byproduct of the strength that the mechanical tension? Like,
Mhm.
how would you make that statement?
That's tough. If I had to put a number on it, I'd probably put it at 20%. Just
Okay.
because if you don't have a pump, I am not sure you trained hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Or ate right or whatever. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, I think the pump is going to happen with training, but I don't think the pump can
For sure.
predict very accurately the amount of growth they're going to have. And really quick, James mentioned sarcoplasmic versus myofibrillar hypertrophy,
Yeah, yeah.
which are big fancy words. Sarcoplasm is just a space around your cells,
Yeah.
Okay.
and myofibrillar hypertrophy would be the muscle fibers themselves.
Okay.
So some people think
Right.
that the pump training leads to sarcoplasmic or just increased fluid retention
Okay.
in the fiber, and some people think lifting heavy leads to myofibrillar growth. The reason people think that is if you lift heavyweight, you get a lot stronger
Right.
than if you achieve your growth by lifting lightweight. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Yeah. It does make total sense.
And there was a paper that was published three or 5 years ago, somewhere in there, that had a very small sample size. They took a subset of their analysis and saw what they said was disproportional sarcoplasmic hypertrophy from training at very high volumes. It was somewhere around 35 to maybe 42 sets on the quads a week. That data has been criticized quite a bit because they took a subset of a subset, which could just be their like error of their measurement.
Right.
So I think science would say, and I'm sorry about this tangent if it's not helpful, but
Oh, it is. Go ahead.
sarcoplasmic hypertrophy might be a thing,
Yeah.
but there's not really strong evidence for it.
Sure.
And I saw a tweet from a scientist that I really respect, and she was pointing out, her name is Karen Esser, that the sarcoplasm supports the myofibrillar portion of a fiber. So it makes sense that you would increase these in proportion to one another
Right.
and wouldn't disproportionately increase one aspect.
Right,
Bias,
right.
yeah.
But lifting light, if you look at myofibrillar growth, like lifting light can grow those muscles, but for some reason, because it maybe doesn't tax the neuromuscular system the same way, it doesn't make you as strong.
Right.
So you can train different ways and get different amounts of growth and strength.
Okay. I want to cover one more of these topics before we go. And then I'll have to have you back on to cover more. But we have a few here, and I want you to pick the one you want to talk about. You said training volume, low versus high, which is a big thing right now. Range of motion, we kind of touched on, but not really. Technique, which is cheat reps versus strict form, which is always a topic online. Fatigue, we covered. Rest periods, and do they matter? And then you had muscle memory for muscle growth and contradictions in science that are frustrating. It would be nice for me if you had some science myths that we could dispel before we went.
Ooh.
But if not, we can cover any of the things that you sent me. That's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Um,
I mean,
trying to think.
we kind of dispelled a couple of them with like
Yeah.
RIR and talking about the different measurements in muscle and why, how the evidence is not as compelling as people make it seem. So we did cover some of those things. If you want to go into any of the topics you sent me, that's also fine.
Yeah. Maybe let's see if I can do volume in a succinct way.
Okay.
Because I think that one's pretty big on social media.
Yeah.
And I can use the volume one to also show kind of a thing that's just I think it should be frustrating to consumers of information that science is producing data that's just really hard to wrap your mind around.
Sure.
And hopefully this discussion can be helpful. But I published a paper 2 years ago that was titled "The Dose-Response Relationship Between Training Volume and Muscle Growth. There Are Still Doubts." And I published that paper because there was something else published that said, "Are there really any doubts?" And it was like saying basically if you question some of the high volume literature that you're a fool. The data is very, very clear.
Yeah.
And in our paper we point out that some of these muscle growth studies are in trained people, and they're seeing so much muscle growth that for me, I don't believe it. Like I don't think it's possible.
Mm.
So we wrote a critique of, and it's just, this is something that would be impossible for a consumer that doesn't do science to know that, hey, this study saw zero point 0.7 centimeters of muscle growth in trained people. If
Yeah.
you can, in 8 weeks,
Yeah. It's
and
crazy.
if you could replicate that, let's say you could replicate that finding 3 times.
Mm.
I think my quads would go from the size they are now to James size quads. If I could replicate that finding 3 times,
Yeah.
that's why I don't believe it.
Yeah. Of course.
And then a paper came out recently, and this also will show that, like, I could, if I wanted tomorrow to become a science-based influencer, I could convincingly make people believe one thing or another thing depending on what I choose.
Right.
So the same research group that's shown a lot of this high volume stuff published a low volume study.
Yeah.
So you might have seen recently, like the science people doing low volume content and
Yeah.
saying,
A lot
well,
of them.
just one set of training session and you can get this much muscle
I've seen a
growth.
lot of that actually. It's driving me crazy.
So there was a recent study by, oh goodness, let me see if I can find this one. Herman. It's out of Brad Schoenfeld's lab. And they had trained people come in and they just did one set per exercise.
Right.
But I want y'all to think about if you signed up for this study, right? So they had trained people come in and they looked at lower body muscle growth. And for the quads, they were doing Smith squat, plate loaded leg press, and machine leg extension. So those 3 exercises, you're doing one set, you're doing that twice a week.
Okay.
And what this study found, and I think why people are really pushing low volume right now, is because they saw 0.37 centimeters of muscle growth. That's more than most other studies. So
Right.
in trained people, only doing 6 sets of quads, they saw more muscle growth than the majority of other studies.
Right.
Like as a scientist, I'm like,
There's got to
that
be
makes no
got
sense.
to be
I
a
don't know how that
positive.
happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you could look at other papers. There's a paper that did 24 weekly sets in the quads by R. Mithingham that saw 0.11 centimeters of muscle growth. Aub, 24 weekly sets for the quads and saw 0.15. So my question, and this is, I said a lot of words. What I want the listener to take away is, how can one study with 24 weekly sets get 0.11 centimeters of growth?
Yeah.
And another study with only 6 weekly sets in trained individuals get 0.37 centimeters of growth. That's like triple the growth and far less work. And it's more muscle growth than the majority of the studies. And as a scientist, when you see these studies portrayed to you on social media, 9 times out of 10, I look at them and I say, oh yeah, that paper, I don't know how they found that, but it doesn't make any sense to me.
Mm.
And it's not that the scientists did anything wrong. It's that a finding in isolation sometimes means nothing without replication.
I was just going to ask if anybody's replicated that at all.
This study is pretty new. It came out this year, I think.
So
So nobody's replicated it yet.
they've done one study with potentially a skewed result, and the whole world has latched onto it as the way forward.
One group, people that like low volume have latched onto it.
Yeah,
People that like
I would speak in generalities. I shouldn't say
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
and
How
then the
many people?
people that like high volume will latch onto the other study.
You look for what you want, don't you? And you look for whatever you seek, you find just to back up your own intention.
Yeah.
See, this is
Uh,
why I hate to go back to this. I'm such a fucking broken record.
No, 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 do it.
This is Sam. This is why I point to experience over studies, because exactly what you're saying, they can make anything look like anything, depending on what they want to find. It's almost like what you're telling me is like, it's almost like they want the result and they trying to find a way to get there.
Yeah. I sometimes think, and I don't want to speak ill of scientists. Like I think they mostly intend good. I
Yeah,
think
sure.
social media is making young up and comers maybe
I think
it's
so.
this weird temptation where like I almost think some young up and coming scientists are asking questions and running studies that they think will get clicks on social media. And then does that impact how you actually collect the data and your integrity as a scientist? I don't know.
I'm going to tell you why. It's been proven time and time again to work. if you're a young kid or whatever, an older person, whatever, and you want to become popular, the fastest way to do it is to say something nobody else is saying. So it's been seen, one of the ways Lane Norton became popular was he was saying things that nobody was saying. Now, he had a lot of evidence behind what he was saying, but I believe he was a proponent of if it fits your macros. At a period in time when bodybuilders were so fixed on this food at this time and this, and I don't want to say for sure Lane was the first one, because the first one I heard of that was saying this thing that was totally opposite, and it really made him more popular. So I think the thinking is behind people that want to gain traction on social media is if I'm saying something different than everybody else, it will get me traction.
For sure. And also the fact is that once they've said it, they have to never give up that because that's their brand.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, because in absolutes.
You have to dig deeper, more into why you say what you say and protect your
brand.
Your brand and your platform.
Yeah.
So I know of people that are in this country that are like people that have their own kind of training philosophies. And I've actually spoke to them in person and I've seen them train in person. They don't necessarily abide 100% to what they promote. Yet the promotion will never see anything other because it keeps them in a good spot.
Yeah.
And that's where it becomes difficult because social media is obviously, again, I know we always kind of come back to social media in these chats, but it does have it has a massive impact on how things are.
The whole thing is about though, right? Because
exactly.
So sorry, Sam, we went off on a little tangent there. So low volume versus high volume. You're telling me there's two studies out there that will kind of espouse either one, but in the general sense, what is the literature telling you? Like, what are you saying? Like, what's the truth between this? Not like I don't want to point to a study that can tell me what I want to hear. What's the kind of the general thing that you're finding?
Well, I think it's probably moderate volumes. It's funny, like the truth is usually in the middle.
Yeah.
Right.
But what science will currently say, at least science people you'll see on social media will say, we haven't found the upper limit yet of volume for muscle growth. But some of that needs context to interpret it appropriately. So, for example, there was a recent study, and I don't know if this content made onto y'all's pages. And I really like the researchers that did the study. They're down the street from me here in Tampa. But they had people do 52 weekly sets. And that's a really high volume for the scientific literature.
Yeah.
And the conclusion online was it wasn't significant, but they're like, it looks like it's trending towards more growth. So a lot of scientific communicators that have this high volume bias were like, we haven't found the upper limit. It looks like you can go as high as 52 sets. Well, what they did in that study, and this is oftentimes what happens in research. A researcher has a lab, they don't have a lot of funding, so they build their programs around what they have in their lab.
Right.
So to reach that 52 sets, they had to do 9 sets of squats, followed by 9 sets of leg press, followed by 8 sets of leg extension. Well, if you're going to do high volume, in my opinion, you should only do 3 or 4 sets of squats and then pick a variety of exercises that are going to hit the muscle in a different way to really maximize muscle growth.
Right.
So another issue with a lot of these studies, and it doesn't mean the studies tell us nothing,
right?
But it means you can't copy and paste and say, no, this study showed this. Well, that's not how we train.
That's right.
We pick a variety of exercises.
Yeah, it's like these studies almost shouldn't be brought to daylight yet. It's almost like the studies they're a work in progress. They're trying to find an answer, but they're not quite there yet. Yeah. It's almost like premature, actually, what's occurring, isn't it? So people are finding these studies prior to them really, truly reaching the goal of what they're aiming for, and then putting the information out there already.
What would be really nice, though, James? I would like to see them come to light, but I'd like to see them come to light the way Samuel's talking about them.
Yeah, they need to. You can tell me disclaimer as such.
Yeah, tell me what you're finding, but also tell me that, hey, this doesn't apply to you because none of our fucking people that we're using for these studies use steroids or use insulin or train using 7 different machines for legs. Like,
or have trained for 20 years
there's a whole bunch of variables that just aren't part of our world.
Do we agree that the majority of the kind of miscommunication is actually coming from a younger field? I feel like it is.
Well, this is why. remember when you were 20 years old? Like, I'll tell you when I was 20 years old and I started, right?
Yeah.
And I forget there's a name for this. I'm sure Samuel probably knows it, but you know that curve where you think you know everything, and then you reach a point where you fucking realize
You realize you know nothing.
Is it the Dunning-Kruger? Is
yes,
that
that's it. That's
yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So I went through that. And I think most people go through that. Like
Yeah.
from age 20 to 25, or maybe even 20 to 30, I was stubborn. I was like, this is the way you train. This is how you do it. I know
Yeah.
everything. Because you start to look at your own results and you're like, well, this must be the way. I think I got it. And then you realize later that you don't know shit. So I think a lot of these TikTok kids are new.
Mhm.
They're coming out. Maybe they're getting some results, or maybe they're getting the traction they want online, and it's just feeding that. Instead of
Well,
speaking the way Sam speaks with
yeah.
a lot of openness to it,
Yeah.
they're trying to build a brand,
For sure.
Yeah.
and it's working. It's working. If you look at some of these pages, they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of comments. Not all of them are good, but they're getting the traction that they want.
It's funny because there's just a war. Like the majority of my content that comes up on my feed is a video that exists, and then someone in the bottom right corner discrediting the video.
Talking about it, yeah.
Yeah, and it's either from it will be from one camp or the other. It doesn't matter. Like
Yeah.
it's 50-50. But then you know what? It's weird because like anything, like product, when there's two existing products that are like a competition,
Yeah.
both succeed.
Right.
It's
Right.
almost like so people just generally people just love to train.
Yeah, but it's almost like what we always say on the podcast, which is all of it works. You just have to
Well,
you
we
just
were
have
going
to
to
find
say
what you love.
when we were talking about training earlier, the majority of us, let's be real, we do a few heavy compound exercises, then we do some
Yeah.
fluff stuff at the end.
Yes.
So our repetitions at the beginning of the workout are lower, more compound exercises, and we follow up with something more isolated with slightly higher rep ranges, perhaps a few more metabolic sets.
That's what I find to be the
That's-
most interesting thing about it. If you actually talk to a bodybuilder,
Yeah.
there is no, and I know we're talking about low volume and high volume training.
It's kind of,
There are people that are very stuck to one or the other in the bodybuilding world, but most bodybuilders that I've come across, the vast majority, I would say, train with low and high volume depending on the exercise.
Yeah.
and I would say this, this is probably the frustration. I think most of the ones that are quite successful as a competitor do that.
Yes.
So the frustration comes from actually the competitive bodybuilders who are trying to educate bodybuilders by saying, look, we kind of do a mix.
Right.
Because they're not picking, because they're trying to say, no, it has to be this or this. I think that's why it creates attention.
Right.
Attention, not tension.
Sam, is there anything else you want to touch on in the low versus high volume conversation to kind of put a button on it?
I would just say I think you could find data to support either point, and I think that just demonstrates that the science is developing and it's not there yet, and that a wide variety of approaches seem to be effective for muscle growth.
Sam, do any of your studies touch on nutrition, or is it mostly training based?
We're designing one right now to do next semester that deals with different deficits in body composition percentages
Yeah.
to see if that influences the amount of muscle growth that you can accomplish.
Yeah.
So we're actually replicating the Schoenfeld volume study in my lab currently. And we give a scoop of protein when they finish, but we don't track their diet.
Right.
The majority of these studies, I mean, some of them will do a food log just to make sure the groups weren't different.
Sure.
But in general, the majority of research isn't doing both. It's rare to see both.
Right.
And the reason is that the participant burden becomes so high sometimes
Yeah.
that everybody drops out of your
You don't
study.
want to do it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess the reason I'm asking is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in thinking this, I feel like there's far more variables in training than there is in diet. Like if you told me, like, remember the old adage, if you eat whitefish, it'll thin out your skin and it's better for the stage. And there's been a whole bunch of studies that are like, that's bullshit. Actually, one that Martin talked about was the difference in collagen and how that can actually thin your skin. So I don't know. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is I feel like when it comes to nutrition, I'm more likely to believe a study than I am in training. Is that valid, or that's my own bias?
I think at this point, there's less people. I don't know if that's true. I'm so in the weeds in my area. I'm aware of multiple people that seem to be exploiting resistance training research to create a presence online.
Right.
I imagine the same can be done with nutrition. Like there
Well,
definitely are like
Oh, for sure. You've got the Eddie
different
Booths and
I'm
guys
camps.
like that.
yeah, I'm not saying that there's not people saying things that are nonsense about nutrition. I guess I'm saying as a bodybuilder,
Mhm.
You don't feel challenged by that. You're confident in your nutrition. You're just like,
it's not that. I just feel like there's so many more variables in training. Like we're talking about it now, you're like, well, there's steroids and there's
oh,
peptide.
for
There,
sure. But then doesn't
there's
that doesn't
the amount of time you've been training and there's so much to
for
create
sure.
to add
But
to the
then
study.
but then the weird thing I was thinking about this earlier before we did the podcast. Even like those kind of things like so steroids and blah blah. Even look at how much impact they have on nutrition as well. Like I was thinking, God, this picture is so large
Yeah,
because,
yeah,
like you
you're
say,
right.
you no, you were discussing, we were discussing protein synthesis earlier, and the
Right.
high, how much body can digest or whatever. There's people again studies. There'll be some people that have done what they consider a study on themselves, testing higher levels of protein while being on anabolic steroids, and they swear that they can digest and process more protein than the next man.
Yeah, but
So,
what I'm saying is if there was a study saying
mm,
that,
mm,
I would be more likely to believe that than I
than the
would.
training ones.
The training studies seem too immature, if that's the
Yeah, yeah,
or
yeah, because they're developed. They're not.
yeah. So I feel like the nutrition, maybe science knows more about nutrition or more about how the body processes food, and maybe that's why I'm more likely to believe those
Do you
studies.
think because nutrition relates to more people across the board because we all need nutrition?
Yeah, I think it's more universal. I think
Yeah.
that, but Sam, I kind of want to know your thoughts. Is that the wrong way to think about it?
No, I think maybe what you're getting at is um, I think nutrition it's probably an older field when it comes to science,
Mm,
and there's a lot more funding.
Okay.
So
yeah.
you look at a lot of these big universities where people get multi-million dollar grants to study different nutritional interventions because that has more of a bearing on health
Sure.
and
Medicine and
wellness
everything. Yeah, for sure.
than, bodybuilding or growing muscle. That's not
Yeah, it's not
that's not a
important.
priority.
It's bottom of the list.
Um, and really, resistance training research has taken a huge upswing in the last 10 years.
Sure.
Probably people like myself, and then others realize that, okay, you can make a career out of studying muscle growth. It's kind of cool.
Mm.
But then with that comes the mess, and like the mess, maybe not intentionally, but like, you know, people are coming up with maybe too many ideas and too many iterations of training. Like, do we really need a study to compare this exercise to that exercise?
Yeah.
If you find a difference, you're probably going to cause more harm than good because I don't think that difference you find is even going to be real.
Right.
And then that's going to get copied and pasted 20 times over on social media.
I
I just wanted to add something for really quickly before we went. It was
sure.
just I was sitting in the car on the way to the gym earlier, and I was thinking of an analogy, kind of what I was going to say today, and it was, you know, I relate training now to the equivalent of someone telling you how to hold a pencil to do a drawing, in a sense that, you know what I mean? Like in a
Yeah.
sense that we're dissecting things so premature to the actual occurrence of the training itself. I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain, but you know
I
what I mean.
understand exactly what you mean. It's just
Yeah, and I thought
we're
that to
trying to
myself.
find we're trying to find answers or dissect things we already have answers to
Yeah,
find to
you
find even better answers.
for sure, and it's as simple as this. Like some things are as simple as you just go in and you put your hand around that dumbbell and you pick it up.
Yeah.
Yes, you can work on your form, but those little minute changes, adjustments. They're not necessary.
No.
You know. Anyway, that
But
was
the
just
funny
something.
the funniest part about it is, James, if they were necessary, they'd be necessary for somebody like you. Do you understand what I mean?
But
If
when
if
you're
we're
fine
if we're
tuning,
talking
you're
about
so yeah.
if we're talking about such a small difference in things, the only person that should actually give a shit is somebody at your level trying to win an Olympia.
Oh,
Not
when you're
not the
really
20-year-old kid that's like, I'm just training to put on some muscle. Those
sure.
differences are so minute. They don't even need to know them.
Well, that's exactly why I was thinking about the pencil thing. Because I'm thinking, unless I want to be the best fine art,
Yes.
unless I want to be like Donna Murphy,
Yes.
don't tell me how to hold a pencil.
Right.
You know?
Before we go, I'm sorry, guys. I got a really hard stop at 1:30 because I got a call, but I want to show Sam's page really quick. If you want to follow Samuel, it's Samuel Buckner. For those listening online, it's Buckner is the last name, Samuel Buckner on Instagram. And Sam, you have a bunch of stuff on here. I'm not sure. I don't know if this is your girlfriend here. I don't know.
That
Uh,
was me a couple years ago.
Yeah. So this is your page here. You have a lot of information on it. If anybody wants to check out Sam's Instagram, this is it. And I don't know if you're available for DM, Sam, if you want to help people out if they message you. You're probably
Yeah.
gonna maybe get an influx now.
Consults maybe.
But I'd love to have you back on so we can discuss more of the topics that you sent out. I know we kind of went off on a few tangents there and didn't get to everything, but I'd love to have you back on if you will.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, this will be up probably tomorrow. Sam, thank you very much, dude. We'll have you back and we'll get more into the weeds. James, thanks for coming on, brother.
Sure. Nice to meet you, Sam.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, boys, we'll see you again.
Take care, guys.
Bye-bye.